Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined for a second time by Dr. Ann-Sophie Barwich. She's Assistant Professor of History and Philosophy of Science and Cognitive Science at Indiana University Bloomington. And today we're going to focus on her new book, Smellosophy, What the Nose Tells the Mind. And it's a very funny title. How did you come up with it?
Oh, it started out as a joke. I remember when I was at the Konrad Lorenz Institute near Vienna, and a colleague and friend of mine went like, "Wait, you're a philosopher and you do smell, so you're a smellosopher." I was like, "Okay, this is so good. Can I use this?" He says, "Absolutely, but this is not how I proposed the book. The book had a much more serious title when I sent it to the publisher, when the publisher accepted it, and then my editor and one of the kind of marketing people at University Press went." This is a nice title, but we saw your title of the website, Smellosophy. We should use this. I was like, okay. I mean, it started out as a joke, it became a reality, and I quite like the ring of it because it makes people stop in their tracks and go like, "You said what?"
Yeah, very funny. So, I mean, it's interesting because last time we've already touched a little bit on the sense of smell and what are some of the insights about neuroscience in general that we can take from it. But before we get into those broader questions, more general questions, let's go down to the nitty gritty of how smell works in humans at least. So, I mean, in terms of the molecules that, I mean, our nose has to have contact with to then the brain interpret them as some smell, are they very complex or not?
Is actually mind-bogglingly complex. So you must imagine you basically have all these chemicals in your surroundings. So you pick up airborne volatile chemicals, and each molecule has about 5,000 individual parameters that are relevant for odor binding with the receptors. So just compare that to vision, where you've got electromagnetic wavelength, compare that to audition, where you've got pressure waves in the air. So you've got in vision or audition actually a kind of low dimensional stimulus. We've got one key parameter that the receptors pick up and then compute. In smell, it's like 5,000 per molecule, and then you never smell individual molecules, but you're constantly surrounded by hundreds of them. Coffee, for instance, so what I'm drinking here, is about 800 molecules, and none of these molecules smells of coffee. It's like the combination, the kind of whole cloud of molecules that creates this image, and that's of course super interesting. So you've got a high dimensional stimulus that is sort of non-spatial because it doesn't of course matter whether a certain part of the molecule is here or here. Like what matters is its direct interaction with the epithelium in your nose. And this is of course still a quest of ongoing research. And in the last couple of years, some fantastic new studies have been published showing A, it's more complex than we thought, and B, it might help us to understand a variety of other processes as well.
Would you say that the sense of smell has been a little bit neglected in neuroscience, particularly? Because, as you said, only recently are people uh, understanding that the sense of smell is much more complex than it looked, or at least than what people thought. Or I mean, people had some assumptions about the sense of smell that it wasn't that relevant and things like that. Correct?
Absolutely. So I should qualify that in the sense that most of the really foundational stuff, really, when it comes to neuroscience, happened in the last 30 years. Because only in 1991, the olfactory receptors were discovered by Linda Buck and Richard Axel. So 30 years ago, that's not very long. There have been people, of course, who've been taking the sense of smell seriously. Gordon Shepherd, for instance, in the 1970s. Neuroscientists know him, of course, because he wrote like foundational books such as The Synaptic Organization of the Brain. So he's like well known in neuroscience, and he was one of the early people who figured out smell is not the odd one out. It's not this kind of idiosyncratic, weird little system that's irrelevant, but it might help us to understand actually the brain. And he took this inspiration from two people earlier, which we know, of course, from the history of neuroscience. One is Ramon y Cajal, and the other one is Edgar Adrian, who both actually early on figured out, so Cajal at the turn of the 20th century, Ramon and Cajal at the turn of the 20th century said, this is like two synapses straight into the cortex, from the ear to the brain. This is like the most direct route between information outside and what's happening, whatever your brain is doing with that information. This should interest us more. This is a model system, has been picked up. And then there was Edgar Adrian, who already looked at the bulb. So this is the kind of first relay station in the olfactory part of the brain where the signals are collected. And he figured out there's some kind of patterns when you basically expose an organism to odorants. But for a long time it was neglected because people thought, this is an irrelevant sense, it's not so cognitively sophisticated as vision or as audition. Nothing could be further from the truth. Or it's an evolutionary decline. Actually, also not true. People said, the olfactory bulb in humans has been shriveled up. No, actually, that's not the case. It's one of the densest areas when it comes to neural population in the brain, and it's not so much that the bulb has shrunk, but the brain has grown. So it's a matter of proportion. It's an interesting system to study scaling and evolutionary developments of brains, of course.
Yeah. What about the complexity of the genes that code for the receptors in the nose epithelium for these kind of molecules?
That's a fantastic question, because it picks precisely on why did people then in the last 30 years find out after the discovery of the olfactory receptors that this is actually much more interesting than we thought, and not just another sense that works like the others in terms of, we just fill in the gaps, is because it's one of the genetically most diverse systems. So up to 4% of your kind of genetic storage is dedicated to the olfactory system. This is more than the immune system. It's one of the most heterogeneous genetic bases of the receptor expression. Actually, you and I and everybody who watches this has a different receptor expression in their nose. So you're literally smelling the world differently because you don't have exactly the same set of receptors. You have 400 humans have about 400 different receptor types. So sometimes the number a couple of years ago was like 350, but right now it's up to about 400. Mice have 1,000 and elephants have even 2,000. So this is one of the large, vision, you've got like 3 color receptors in terms of cones, and you've got the rods, but here you've got 400 different types, and they detect different parts of different molecules. So your brain is actually facing a big data problem in the sense that, you have a combinatory interaction. You've got a molecule with 5,000 different features interacting in a combinatorial fashion with 400 different receptors. So where you've got basically one receptor picking up different parts of different molecules and one molecule being detected via different parts by different receptors. This is why you can smell all these kind of different smells, all these kind of chemical structures. And this is why if you smell something that has been synthesized in the laboratory just 5 minutes ago, you don't have to evolve new receptors. No, you're often picking up right away. Otherwise, perfumery would be kind of a bad business if you had to wait for people to kind of develop the receptors for the new things, for the new sense you're developing. So it's one of the most insanely fascinating systems when it comes to genetics. And in that context, because of that diversity, not only does it allow us to see, to detect so many different smells, but also it's the only the only sense where you can artificially create entirely new stimulus that has never been on the face of the earth. So you can create in the lab a chemical that has never existed on Earth with a smell that has never existed on Earth. That is mind-blowing. Mm-hmm. Yeah. How does the brain recognize something that your ancestors never have smelled? It's cool.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. So we have these olfactory stimulus represented by the molecules that hit, let's say, our nose epithelium, and then there's receptors there, as you said. What happens next in terms of where the signal goes?
That's actually a good way to start out to lay out the system, which looks very simple from the outset, but then it gets more complicated when you kind of dive in. And you actually have a shallow 3 pathway system. So first the molecules interact with the sensory neurons in the kind of epithelium on the top of your nose. And in these sensory neurons, you have the olfactory receptors. Now, what is interesting is that each sensory neuron only expresses one receptor type. So one receptor type is one gene. And what happens then is that these sensory neurons transmit their signal to a place called the olfactory bulb, which just sits on top of your nose. It's at the frontal, in the frontal lobe of your brain. And this is, of course, you must imagine you've got a plethora, shit tons is, I think, the official metric, shit tons of cells coming into your brain. So how does the brain actually organize all these signals with this combinatory interaction? What happens here is a beautiful trick for, I think an engineer would love this kind of organization, because you have not just one gene or one receptor type expressed in one neuron, but also all neurons that express one receptor type / gene are converging together in small spaces in the olfactory bulb, kind of neurospheres that look like little nests that are called the glomeruli. So you have through that an individual pattern for each odorant in the bulb, because you've got different spots lighting up. Looks like a map, it's not. We can come to that later, but at least it looks like one for now. And this is the first relay station where all the sensory neurons are collected and they converge depending, okay, this gene, this receptor gene here, this receptor gene there, this one there. And then this signal is picked up by the mitral cells, which innervate these glomeruli and send their signals to a couple of areas in the cortex, especially most predominantly the primary olfactory cortex, which is called the piriform cortex, because it looks like a piriform and neuroscientists like a good joke. And this is where it gets completely chaotic, because instead of maintaining that kind of neat pattern, it fans out. It looks like an absolute mosaic. It's as if you step from a neat English garden into the savannah, where suddenly there's a tree here and there's a bush here and there's something here. There's no organization whatsoever. And that is what fascinated neuroscientists over the last 10 years, especially 10, 20 years. Like, why does this brain abandon this neat appearance of a map? It's not one, and we can come to that, but at least the appearance of a map, and just fan out and abandon this beautiful order? So what happens here? And that's an interesting neuroscientific puzzle, which I also think is interesting from a philosophical perspective, because the question that comes from that is, well, hang on a second, what is happening here? This is a conceptual foundation of modern neuroscience when we think of mapping, when we think of signal representation and how the brain organizes signals from the world and might kind of mirror or represent them in some form of meaningful way, that we can speak of a reality or world represented in the brain, which we have in vision, which we have in audition. In smell, that doesn't seem to be the case. What does that mean for our perception?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I was just thinking about when back, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that it was back in the 50s or 60s that Hubel and Wiesel studied vision in cats, and they noticed that different neurons fired to vertical and horizontal lines. So, I mean, the way the visual cortex is organized, it seems that different parts deal with, for example, different orientations in space and things like that. Do we find something similar to that anywhere in olfaction? I mean, in the olfactory bulb, the primary olfactory cortex, or not?
So this is an interesting question, because I love the logic of the visual system, and the whole discovery story is beautiful, but to apply that to smell won't work. And one of the reasons is you don't have these kind of, one thing is you don't have these kind of spatial features with smell. It doesn't matter in what particular orientation a molecule is somewhere outside in the world. It just matters when it hits your receptors. So this is why smell is not a spatial sense in the same way as vision. You can use smells to orient yourself, but that's not the same. You can't detect clouds in a spatial way that would give you an accurate representation of smells in the world, where it matters that this molecule is here or here. No, there might be airflow, so it's unfeasible to represent it that way. There are also no spatial features in the same way as we have with visual objects. I mean, it doesn't make sense to speak of the orientation or the direction of a smell in the same way we talk about visual objects. So when it comes to feature extraction, there is not the same kind of features we are extracting or that we are combining into a perceptual object or perceptual image. I prefer to speak of image here. That being said, the cells are stimulus specific. So it depends how we model it. There are stimulus specific cells. However, they are not just stimulus specific, but quite often broadly tuned. So it's not just, okay, this neuropopulation just responds to, let's say, the polar surface area of a molecule, or this one just responds to a specific functional group or the orientation of an atom in a molecule. That is relevant for the detection, but you can have a receptor, for instance, that then sends its signal through the neurons that might respond to a variety of completely unrelated and different features. It might say, oh, I like that sulfur molecule of this molecule, and oh, I like the polar surface area in that range of this type of molecule, and I might like, I don't know, the kind of double bond in this kind of configuration of a bicyclic compound. The brain, all the brain sees is what the receptors tell the brain. And this actually doesn't tell you whether the receptor, once it's active, what is that chemical feature it detected. It could be A, it could be B, it could be C. If it can detect different things, the brain wouldn't know which of these different things. So all it sees is a whole spread of a pattern on the epithelium. So it's a pattern recognition device that you have to see which features in combination, which chemical features over the entire combination might represent or might constitute, categorize a certain smell. So you have a feature selectivity, but not in the same way as vision.
Yeah. So by studying the sense of smell, can we get new insights or new knowledge about how other senses work? I mean, are there any important similarities between the sense of smell and other senses?
I think so. So quite often people go like, well, but there are many things in smell that are similar to vision. Well, yes, of course they are. The point is we need to find out what these similarities really are. And quite often we start out with a theory of vision that is also quite underdeveloped because we often still adopt some kind of pre-scientific notions and therefore emphasize the wrong things. What I think in order to understand the senses and not just theories of vision, applying to theories of perception, but really go like, well, we do have audition, we have touch, we have taste, and even touch is kind of different things. We've got pressure, we've got temperature, so we also have pain sensation, we have interoception, we have proprioception. If we want a theory of perception, we got to think towards the what are the sensory mechanisms that create certain sensations, that create variation, that create certain divergence? What are the genetic foundations that lead to differences in perception or perceptual expression? What are the similarities and what are the differences across the senses? And how does that help us to then determine how the senses interact? With vision, for instance, when we think of vision as a spatial sense, I think we need to look at it much more from the coupling with the motor system, and especially with proprioception. To what extent? And it's not even just my idea. I mean, if we think back to Hermann von Helmholtz, who's my hero of the 19th century, he's been saying that. I mean, he actually said, if we look at vision just in terms of vision, and we've got stimulus patterns on the retina, we wouldn't be able sometimes to differentiate whether it's a certain image or a scenery. That kind of depends on us as moving organisms to kind of make inferences, which he called unconscious inferences, about the world. So a lot of the spatial representation and vision is contingent on our experience as motor beings. And in a similar way, I also think if we look at smell, for instance, we might get a better understanding of these principles, how the senses interact, what is acquired, what is learned in what sense, what is more culturally learned, what is more kind of embodily learned, what is also genetically determined. So to what extent are there certain differences that link to different sensitivities in receptor reactions, all these kind of things. It gives us a better understanding of not just looking at the expression of perception as, okay, here's your sensory product, and now we're inferring back to the world. No. We often have this kind of from the stimulus to perception trope, and I think this is harmful because in between is biology and psychology. And that's the interesting bit we're trying to understand, because there's nothing given in the world that is not in some way processed for the organism to make an image. And that is that can otherwise lead to a lot of kind of misunderstandings.
Mm-hmm. So you touched on these. Can we say that smell is genetically determined, or that it is basically something that we acquire through development, or something in between?
I think the answer is both yes and both. It's both yes. So there are certain things that are definitely acquired. There are some things that have a genetic foundation. And when it comes to the genetic foundation, that plays into which receptors are expressed and what's the receptor sensitivity. And I'll give you an example, two examples, which are my favorite examples, because they just show why it's not just about, oh, smell is so kind of tricky and hard to study. No, the idiosyncrasies are precisely what tell us something about the system, about perception, about the principles of sensory processing. Let's say cilantro. When you invite somebody for dinner, you've got, well, pre-pandemic times, you invite a couple of people for dinner, you made something nice, and you always had this one person who didn't like cilantro, which was just a nuisance because I love cilantro. But you always have like one. I have always one or two students in my class, and I always ask them like, who of you doesn't like cilantro? And you've got like kind of the hand going up, like, well, I don't like it. Well, these are mutants. In the sense which is, yeah, they look at me also like, I'm what? But they're mutants in the sense that they have a mutation near one of the receptor genes, olfactory receptor genes. So this is why they actually perceive cilantro as kind of pungent and soapy. This is why they perceive it really different. Same molecule, different perception. So this is one thing where the genetic basis plays in. There's another example, which is androstenone, which is a pig pheromone. So pigs just find each other sexy when they smell it, fine. But we also perceive it, but we can perceive it in so many different ways. So some people say, well, I find it this deeply unpleasant because it smells like urine. Then there are other people who also find it unpleasant, but they conceive it more as like body odor. And then there are people who like it, like, oh no, this is a pleasant odor because it smells woody. Like, okay. And then there are people who like it because they think, oh, this is floral, this is really nice. So you have entirely same molecule, entirely different perceptions. I mean, we're talking from pleasant to unpleasant, from floral and woody to body odor and urine. And the reason that people perceive it so differently there were a couple of studies, some in the 1980s, and then recently in 2019 again, showing that this goes back to genetic differences that influence the sensitivity of the receptors. This is one factor, genetic. However, you can also show that people develop different sensitivities and different perceptions of the same molecule based on age, based on sex, and based on familiarity with the smell. So how often are you exposed to something and what context you're exposed to something. So this is why I say it's more than one answer to this kind of situations. Some things do have a genetic basis, but that doesn't also mean that it's unchangeable or that it's fixed. Quite often you must imagine you also don't have the same receptors in your life the whole time. You actually change your receptor expression, especially when you move habitats. Because every 3 to 4 weeks you renew the neurons in your epithelium. Otherwise you would, I mean, this is one of the few constant neurogenesis examples, the olfactory system. Otherwise you wouldn't smell after 2 or 3 colds because, well, it's a great source for infections, which we now notice with COVID, of course. And here you also, if you move around, because if you move, let's say, from Portugal to China, or from Portugal to South Africa, or from Portugal to America, or to wherever you go, you will have a different chemical environment. So your body needs to adapt to a new chemical environment. This is the benefit of your nose. It's the most flexible system. So it actually expresses different receptors after a while to accommodate your body perceiving, detecting. It's the most accurate chemical detector, biochemical detector on the face of the earth. And it adapts your body towards, okay, I'm in a different chemical environment. I have to kind of figure out a new way to measure the world, so to speak. And so it's both. It's genetic, but it's also acquired in the sense that you have to learn how to then basically, it's not just figure out what the chemicals are, but also in what combinations they occur, what's good, what's bad, in what concentration, all that kind of stuff. And you do that actually without being consciously aware of it all the time, which is just mind-boggling.
Yeah. So earlier we talked about how we can compare the sense of smell to other senses, but there are also other parts of our cognition that the sense of smell interacts with. So, for example, memory, right? It is informed and interacts with memory, for example, correct?
Absolutely. And the first thing which people often say is like, "Oh yeah, Proust Madeleine, isn't that great? That wonderful?" It's like, "Oh no, it's actually nonsense." In the sense that I often wonder. I saw that actually the first person who made me aware of that is Avery Gilbert, who wrote a fantastic book, What the Nose Knows. Haha, I think it's a great title. It's like, damn it, Avery. I would have liked to kind of use that title, but so you can see we're here for the puns. And he actually said like, well, look at Proust's Madeleine. Look at these couple of pages where he describes it. There's not a single descriptor of the odor quality. You don't know how the darn thing smells or even tastes. So all he basically, and also this is not how we commonly experience this kind of memory flash. Like sometimes you go somewhere and you're like, suddenly this smells like my father's garage. I had that in a DIY market. It's like, whoa. But Proust sits there and contemplates and tries to recreate this memory. So this is much more about using smell or the kind of Madeleine experience. A lot of it is motor action. I think we're always forgetting the motor action, the motor coupling. But to recreate it, to use it as a tag. So it's not about the odor. It's like a memory tag for an experience to kind of connect certain things together. And in a certain way, this is how odors are also used quite often unconsciously. We're learning odors by associations, and the odors we remember are the ones we know from childhood. So they are tags of experience. When you have a good wine, you don't remember that prominent sherry note. You remember when you had it, the lighting, the atmosphere, and especially the people you had it with. It's just a tag. This was a good experience. This stuff was good, so I might have it again.
What about expert noses? I mean, those people, for example, that taste wine and they're already trained to notice certain notes or certain aspects
Yeah.
of that wine and its composition. I mean, is that really something reliable? Can we rely on those people to distinguish between different kinds of wine? Or not.
Yes, I know that wine tasters and sommeliers in particular have a bad reputation, and there have been several studies going, "Oh, debunking wine tasting is junk science," and these guys are just, arrogant pricks who throw out all these words. No, they actually are really, really good at this stuff. There was this one study claiming that wine tasters can't distinguish between red and white wine, but this study has been debunked because it was actually an example. I use this as an example for my students. This is bad science. First of all, these were not wine experts. These were first semester enology students. So sommeliers, they take a decade to get to the point where they can really reliably within a minute tell you the vintage, the year, the blah blah blah. So first year semester, of course you can fool students. I mean, seriously. Also, it was forced choice, so you didn't have the option to say they kind of smell the same. You had to say this particular set of descriptors is this wine, or this particular set of descriptors is that wine. So this is just a bad study. And of course, there's some things where you can fool people, but that's just because there are certain ambiguities within the sensory system. But why smell experts, for instance, perfumers, wine tasters can do that is perfumers, for instance, have to learn about 1,500 to 2,000 individual odorants. This is why it takes so long. They learn them like other people would learn a vocabulary, for instance, when they learn a new language. And that takes time, and you have to have, you're training your nose, your memory to identify a certain signal with a set of descriptors. Then you also learn, of course, for instance, what kind of combination of molecules might come together as another quality, because quite often it's not that smell doesn't behave additively, but you can have more than the sum of its parts. So this is where a certain cloud of molecules can represent something. And with wine tasters in particular, I mean, if you look what they're doing, you need to look at the whole procedure. There's this beautiful 1 minute clip from this I think it's on Netflix, which is a documentary following 4 master sommeliers studying wine. And if you look at this one scene where he identifies within 1 minute, and he talks faster than I do, so transcribing him was a nightmare because I have it in the book. It's like, oh, for heaven's sake. So yes, and he does a whole procedure because he doesn't sniff and tell you what wine. This is like Sherlock Holmes of wine tasting, because he has a wine. And then he swirls it. Why does he swirl it? Well, first of all, he holds it at a 45-degree angle. And this is not to look posh and arrogant, but he looks how the light breaks. That tells you already what kind of wine you're dealing with. So is there an oil film? What's the color of the wine? Is it darker? Is it more yellow? That already gives you a first category of what kind of wine you're dealing with. And these are guys and girls who learned a variety of wine profiles. So they're making already some inferences. So this, like hypothesis, this could be this set of wines. Then he swirls it and he smells it. And he swirls it because it increases the surface of the wine, allowing for a broader bouquet to come off in terms of molecules. Not just not just the light molecules, but the heavy molecules and all of them together. So you've got really, if you do it at home, if you've got a red wine, there it works precisely well. Smell it, swirl it, and then smell it again. And the lighter notes suddenly will hit you. Like when you just smell it, you've got the heavy notes, then you swirl it and the lighter notes come through. It's super cool. So this is how he already, like he already can make inference. Okay, this might be actually this wine rather than this wine. Then he also tastes it at some point, of course, like what's the acidity, what's the tannins, all these kind of things. So it's a whole deductive procedure. And at some point, he just confirms the hypothesis that has been more and more refined and more. It's refined observation. So this is actually why it's not just simply nonsense. We're fine with, let's say, art experts going, this is a painting from the 17th century Belgian artist so-and-so because the brush stroke was like that. We wouldn't, well, we kind of find it like this is kind of a wizardry trick, but this is expertise. I mean, of course, there's we don't doubt expertise in other areas. We just doubt it with smell because we think they can't possibly smell all that kind of stuff in a wine just because we can't. Well, why not? I mean, that just assumes that we take sensory perception to be a given, that experience is right now, everything that you can experience is in one moment. No. You can actually, with like every sensory perception, kind of like peeling an onion, you're arriving at more and more levels of refined observation. There's more to any kind of quality than your first impression. That's true for smell, that's true for vision, that's true for audition. With smell, it's just more visible, for lack of a better term, because quite often there's also this kind of border between conscious and unconscious processing. Mm-hmm. So if I give you a wine and you smell it and you're like, oh, that's a very nice cherry note. And I say, yeah, and have you smelled that vanilla note? And suddenly it's in your mind. And you're like, how could I not have smelled this before? It was there all the time, but you weren't aware of it. Like there's a nice play here. But you would have seen, of course, the red necessarily in a painting. I mean, it doesn't suddenly pop into your consciousness like that.
Yeah. I mean, this reminds me of another thing because I studied dentistry and there's that thing of a color scale to choose the color that we would like to apply to a particular tooth. It's interesting because you learn how to distinguish between the different shades of white and yellow, and for example, for an untrained person, if she looks at a particular tooth, and I mean, she just might say that it's white or yellowish, but we know the code for that particular color, and we're trained for that. So I guess that probably it's in this case it's for vision, but for smell, something similar to that happens to wine tasters, for example.
Yeah, you're able to distinguish most minute differences if you pay attention, if you train yourself, and that's why you really get better with smelling if you train it. I mean, I was surprised to see how much more I was able to just simply perceive by paying attention and then at some point starting to train myself. And this is where one of my colleagues, Barry Smith in London, he's living the dream. I mean, he a couple of years ago got a grant on aroma perception in wine. I was like, oh, damn it, Barry, this would have been the thing to do. And he showed me how to taste wine. I was very lucky that I could interview him for the book, and he showed me how to taste wine. And that just blew my mind.
Yeah. So I've asked you about the relationship between the sense of smell and things like memory. What about decision making? Is the sense of smell important for decision making? Because since, I mean, we pay lots of attention to, for example, our sense of vision, and things that we see, but I mean, I guess that people don't think that much about how the sense of smell might also influence their decision making.
Oh yes, and I like to joke that if you go into a supermarket or some kind of drugstore, what you see is people sniffing the shampoo, as if that has nothing to do with like, oh yes, I need to get a shampoo to get rid of my dandruff. Doesn't matter. They sniff it whether they like the smell or not. So the same dandruff shampoo is like in five, seven different smells. We do because it gives us a signal of what to let close to your body or to your skin or what to eat and even with whom to associate sometimes in the sense that we do make a lot of decisions based on smell. Not all of that is conscious or consciously processed, but it plays a lot of influences within like what we kind of prefer, what we're biased to, what we're biased against, and if you because many people say yeah but it's just smell, and I remember that I mean since I've been doing researching smell for actually a decade now, I remember some years ago there was a very famous philosophy professor who looked at me like, yeah but you know smell it's just there for a bit of pleasure. I was like, what do you mean just? I mean really, what do you mean just? You're sitting in front of me with a really nice steak and a really nice wine and I think you pick the wine and the steak for the pleasure. So I don't know what you mean by just. I mean, there's a kind of a weird disparity when it comes to our real decision making and how philosophers like to talk about decision making sometimes because it's much more sensory based than philosophers would like to admit, perhaps. And through the COVID stuff, it just showed how much people rely on their sense of smell. You might just go into a new home, into a new house, and you immediately make a judgment about that house. Is it kind of smoky? Is it kind of dirty? How? Or you go into a new holiday, and you immediately have like when you enter a new country, a feeling for the place, as if smell is kind of an extended form of touch. It's kind of narcotic, or it's very crisp. Like you actually have a sensory impression that is partly also conveyed through your sense of smell. You don't always perceive it as olfactory, but it is part of your like olfaction is always at the backseat of your consciousness, but it is part of your decision making. To what extent you evaluate the place, not just liking or disliking, that's kind of simplistic to put, but even just how you associate a place with certain forms of qualities or where you go, how long you stay. Yeah.
Yeah, and even if it was just for pleasure, let's say, it wouldn't be that unimportant because pleasure tells us about the kinds of things that we've evolved to like and to seek for or seek out for, and those are really relevant to our lives, right? To our survival, reproduction, and things like that.
No, and partly also to extend our appreciation of our qualities. It's not just what we evolve to like, but a lot of things change also. Well, there's kind of a complexity with also acquired tastes. I mean, every country, so to speak, there are interesting social issues related to that because every country or every culture has a particular kind of food where every other culture goes like, this is disgusting. Like the Germans have Blutwurst, which is blood sausage, and non-Germans just look at us like you guys are weird. But then you've got others which have like rotting fish or dried rotting fish and things like that. So, and there's also my favorite was in South Africa, mapane worms, which are dried caterpillars. I ate them. They're actually not that bad. I mean, they're not the greatest thing on earth, I think, but they're actually not that bad. They just look disgusting, like really gross. Google it, mapane worms. Ugh. But so every culture has kind of a type of food that's associated with a certain texture, smell, and but it is almost like an in-group, out-group thing. It's quite interesting. But so it's one thing where it's not just like evolved to like, but also partly socially embedded likes and dislike, and also your preferences change over your lifespan, both when it comes to smells as well as when it comes to taste sensitivities. I mean, for instance, coffee or beer is very bitter, and kids don't like it, but at some point we acquire a taste for it. When it comes to we're less sensitive to bitter tastings, and also when it comes to certain smells, for instance, or kind of flavors and aromas. We kind of some we like later. I mean, olives I hated as a kid. Now I love them. So these are kind of, well, not especially in a martini glass, but otherwise also olives as such. But there's a change here, and also when it comes to partner choice, sometimes. I mean, like the same thing in different places can mean different things. So body odor in the metro in New York is disgusting, but in certain other combinations, let's put it that way, it can be quite arousing.
Yeah, and that thing about choosing a romantic partner, it reminds me of. I'm not sure if those studies were replicated or not, or even if they were robust, but those studies on the MHC genes, the major histocompatibility complex genes, I mean, and people preferred other people that had different genes, right? Because their combination would make their babies more robust in terms of their immune system or something like that, something along those lines, right?
Yeah. So the interesting thing with these kind of studies, of course, is that this is not just in humans, but also in mice. And not only can we, I mean, detect whether somebody has a complementary immune system or not, but also whether mice do it. So I remember that Avery Gilbert, the one with what the nose, his most cited study is one where he gave people mice in sandwich boxes and mice turds in sandwich boxes to smell, because he was at the Monell Center at the time, and they were studying, for instance, okay, so mice can detect each other's like, it might just be the difference of one gene in terms of the immune system and to what extent they prefer each other. And he thought, I want to know whether the humans can smell what the mice are smelling. So he gave people different mice, genetic strands of mice to smell, mice turds, mice urine, and in sandwich boxes, and people could distinguish the different mice strands by like minor genetic differences. And that kicked off, and people were getting then interested. Wait a second, if people can detect genetic strands of mice, can they also detect like immune differences amongst each other? And this is where the study also partly came from, to say, well, to find out to what extent, for instance, women prefer the sweat or the body odor, like often like in t-shirts, of men with a complementary immune system. The interesting thing is that contraceptive routines seem to change that. So if the women were on the pill and you have a different hormonal status, hormonal constitution of your body, then they preferred the sweat of men with a similar immune system. And I kind of, my mentor and I would kind of like to joke, well, that might explain divorce rates. So Stuart Feuerstein, my mentor in New York, because like, well, think about it. When do people usually divorce? Right after marriage, when they're changing contraceptive routines to get kids. And then, the love of your life loses sex appeal because they smell different. So it's like, huh. I mean, it's of course an anecdotal inference, but nonetheless, there is something about it where it's like, that's interesting, let's find out more. But as you also rightly said, the danger, of course, is to A, overinterpret these kind of differences, and B, how much it can be replicated, of course, as well. I mean, I would love to see more studies on that. These are very difficult studies. Behavioral studies in smell are difficult because there are so many factors and variables to think about. But also, there needs to be more funding. I mean, one of the issues why there haven't been enough studies on these kind of issues is because the money is lacking, and these are very expensive, especially to have a significant sample size. So I hope that through COVID, as bad as it is for the world, it was quite good for the olfactory community because people started taking it seriously.
Yeah. So let's now talk about more general questions. We've already touched a little bit on this before, but is the idea of functional localization in the brain outdated by now? Or, I mean, can we look at the brain as something composed by different areas or different parts that are more or less isolated among them, or even each part is responsible for a particular function or a particular set of functions, and other parts of the brain have nothing to do with it?
So I think the traditional idea of localization has failed. That being said, I would not say that localization as such is a failed concept. I think there's some
Okay.
things where it's actually very helpful to use ideas about functional localization, but not as the fundamental principle of the brain. It is something that I think at some point is very important to look at the impact of development and experience on the specialization of the brain. And there are also structural differences. I mean, if we just look at how different areas really have a different cell architecture, I think that matters. And I think that matters how signals are processed, how they're integrated. But there's also a lot of flexibility. So I think it's one of the interesting principles of the brain, but it has lost its priority as the fundamental principle of the brain.
Yeah, and what about modularity of the mind? That's an idea that already comes from perhaps the 60s, 70s, right, in neuroscience, and then more recently, evolutionary psychologists have adopted that idea, the sort of, okay, so each specific module of the human mind has evolved for to serve a particular function. What do you think about that?
I think I'm going in the direction of the churchlands here, in the sense that I think this is a misguided idea, and to channel my inner churchland, I think this is bullshit. But in not bullshit, but I think the danger here is that we are putting the cart before the horse, because we're dividing the mind into different modules, into different mental faculties, without even knowing what they might be. We have often a pre-scientific understanding of memory, consciousness, perception, and all these kind of different aspects, music perception or language perception, as kind of modules. But quite often they are very hard to differentiate and often overlapping with certain cognitive principles. If we think of music and mathematics, there are some interesting similarities here when it comes to the kinds of processing required for each, and also where they're different. I don't know. Then we would have to talk about submodules and all this kind of stuff. So why I say I'm more with the churchlands here is because they said that instead of just trying to map our preconceived notions of the mind and the different capacities of the mind somehow onto the brain and our data about the brain, we might also use recent insights. I mean, we have a century of fantastic insights into the brain from neuroscience, and to rethink also our seemingly intuitive and pre-scientific notions of the mind and of mental faculties, because quite often they might not be so divided. I mean, for instance, if we talk about smell, we can talk about fragrance and flavor in terms of orthonasal and retronasal smell. But flavor is connected to touch, it's connected to taste. I mean, there's so many intertwined functions that are hard to modularize in the way in which, for instance, Fodor would talk about the mind. I like some ideas of Fodor, and I think he was right in some ways, but in other ways, I think it's often then misleading because, as I said, like, it puts the cart before the horse. I think there's some interesting functional differences, but we shouldn't start with them. We should find out which they are. I mean, you can't carve up the mind before even having an understanding of what kind of different functions you're trying to describe and what they really are. And memory, last thing I want to mention here, memory is my favorite concept. I like the work of John Bickle here, and a couple of others who have showed that, well, memory has changed quite a lot if we look at how psychologists and philosophers have thought about it prior to neuroscientific insight, and then with increasing genetic insight, with increasing molecular details and the kind of mechanistic insight, we see that memory is not a film in the brain or some image, but it's a changing neural trace, and we can manipulate memory, we can overwrite memory. The moment you recall a memory, it will change how the memory is encoded. So it's changing over time. It's much more flexible. It's we can see that we've got homologies in the receptors between bacteria and like mammals. So there's clearly something more going on here. How we got to understand what memory is as a cognitive capacity and how to link to behavior through the empirical stuff.
Does it make any difference if Fodor basically defined modules as encapsulated and evolutionary psychologists, at least since Lida Cosmides and John Tooby published The Adapted Mind, don't accept the idea that modules are encapsulated and say that they communicate with one another, they exchange information and things like that?
I think it's one of those things where it explains some of the concerns I'm having, but I'm not sure it's sufficient. It's an accommodation. It's an explanatory accommodation of these kind of things where somebody might push back, but I would say what it could accommodate it, but I'm not sure it explains it properly. And this is an empirical question, so we got to see. I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical for the reason that it's always a just so story in which they build these explanations. Or not always, but I should be a bit more careful. But it's quite often building on a data accommodation that can be questioned then on other areas, such as, for instance, well, that kind of seems to assume that, first of all, there is a stability of cognitive functions over generations of, and we're talking hundreds of generations of humans by now. That's an empirical question. Why do we really assume that these functions were, in fact, really the same and not shaped through both let's say ecological interaction, because humans have created now completely different niches than several hundred years ago, as well as social changes and cultural transmission. If we think back to Celia Hayes' 2018 book Cognitive Gadgets, where we have developed a lot of tools that also allow and facilitate new cognitive functions. I mean, her assumption is that a lot of the cognitive mechanisms we have are not innate and have always been the same, but which were transmitted and developed through cultural transmission. Sorry. And one of them is language. Then she has also imitation. She also has theory of mind, etc. And I also think, what about science? Like science, instead of just seeing it as a stable, unchanging, ahistorical activity over time, over hundreds of years, is also a cognitive gadget. It allows us to engage and ask questions about the world in a way that hardly any other activity has allowed us to do. It allows us to observe in a new way. Why shouldn't that change in a certain way also our mental mechanisms? And this is where I think evolutionary psychologists too often assume the mind to be too stable for this kind of functional modularization. And I'm not convinced by it. It can be accommodated, yes, but you can also accommodate the same observations that the sun revolves around the earth by your observations. So the question is, what's the mechanism behind? So in the end, the dispute between evolutionary psychologists and people who are skeptics about these explanations, such as me, say we need to look at the mechanisms and not just at the data accommodation.
Yeah. So let's talk about a concept coming from philosophy of mind. What about qualia? Because that's a very, I mean, it's a tricky thing, and different people define it, I guess, in different ways. And then there's that thing about, okay, we have the workings of the brain, but then we have the subjective experience, and how does one connect with the other and things like that. So what do you think about that?
You already saw my immediate response, like, qualia is, let me be honest, I am so done with that concept. I'm again on the side of the churchlands, on Bickle and Dennett, who way before me have said, oh, for heaven's sake, get rid of that concept. I can tell you why I would like to get rid of it and why I think it's actually not helpful.
Okay.
It's quite often used in a way that, as you say precisely, this kind of subjective experience, and that's used to, this is why we can't reduce, for instance, the mind to the brain. And I think nonsense. Absolute nonsense. One thing is, smell is a good example that has been often used, like, well, see, you smell things differently than I do, and I don't know what your qualia, blah, blah, blah. Well, first of all, yes, we can. In the last couple of years, we've shown that a lot of these seemingly qualitative differences, the subjective experience, actually can be linked to causal mechanisms such as genetics, other physiological mechanisms, and also cognitive bias, context. These can all be studies. These are actually factors linking to causal mechanisms. So the objectivity is not defined by we're really perceiving the same category from, like, in terms of associating with the same stimulus, but what are the mechanisms that give rise to these things? Can they be established over different individuals within the same kind of organism or species? And so this is one thing where I think, like, this is where the debate is just misleading. The other thing is, Well, of course, there is a subjective experience in terms of how it feels like, because we are made out of chemicals and they have an effect on how what it's like is going to be like. So this is why I think we often forget the fact that we are organic beings, that what you eat, what drugs you take, whatever you do is going to affect what something is like. And then people are like, yeah, but we haven't found a final explanation yet. Yeah, of course not. I mean, we actually have learned quite a lot through a relatively young field of neuroscience, of biochemistry, compared to physics, which still hasn't solved gravity yet. I mean, I don't see where that skepticism comes from, or why it's considered to be so big in the minds of some. Philosophy has had much more time to solve consciousness, and it still hasn't either. So there we are. I just think there's much more interesting questions to get out from thinking about qualitative expressions through the way our brain processes things. The brain being embodied. I mean, this is why I have some issues with embodiment. They often forget that the brain is part of the body. So yes, the body is important, but if you're brain dead, you can feel whatever you like in terms of through your body. It won't have any kind of qualitative expression. Well, at least if that was a bit polemic. But the point being is that qualia is often kind of used as an object, as this kind of object of experience, is reified, and it's used to address philosophical concerns that are scholastic. And I think we gotta rethink the questions we're asking. I think there's a new role for philosophy. Instead of just exercising the same questions and using here and there some bits of science to make more sense of these questions today, it's the wrong way. We shall rather kind of look at what new questions might we have to develop, or how have these questions changed, and what concepts. There has been a graveyard in the history of science when it comes to scientific concepts, and I think there ought to be a graveyard of concepts in philosophy as well. And we got to be more honest with our graveyard. We're still having so many zombie concepts, literally philosophical zombies walking around us. And I think this is just, it sounds plausible to teach to undergraduates because you get them excited and you get them into certain questions, but it shouldn't occupy the main debate.
Yeah, I mean, in the West at least, we also tend to be mind-body dualists. I mean, there are people like Paul Bloom that say that that is an innate thing. It could be just cultural, I'm not sure, but there's also that, right? That we tend to very easily separate the mind from the brain or the rest of the body.
Absolutely. In fact, I had a fantastic essay from one of my grad students here at IU, and she wrote an essay looking at the mind-body problem because she's originally from Kazakhstan. And she's like, well, this duality doesn't make any sense if you look at the Kazakh language. This is actually a language-induced duality. But if you look at concepts such as mind, consciousness, and sensory perception in the Kazakh language, that duality isn't existing in the way it's not mappable. So this might be indeed, I think, partly a product of the way we describe the world, rather than really how we should think about the interaction of the mind as part of a body, as part of an environment. So this is one thing, the language. The other thing is also the habitat. I mean, in Kazakhstan, you have a lot of people who are changing habitats quite a lot. You've got nomads, for instance. How different would the whole mind, body, environment interaction look like if you have a group of people who change habitats a lot versus us who are always in the same environment? Of course, that has an effect on how we perceive things. There was recently a study which I want to look into more in detail. So it's on my reading list about a group of people in Namibia who actually don't perceive the Mulalaya illusion. So while we thought that might be a universal principle, they apparently see these two lines really as the same length. They are not fooled by the arrows pointing inwards or outwards. So I want to look at how they studied that, because of course, like, these are always tricky studies, but I find this is an interesting pointer towards something we often overlook. How universal are the principles of perception? I think they are, in terms of, on the one hand, universal, but we often model them on the wrong principles. So what did we miss here? What are the real underlying mechanisms, instead of just, again, this is an expression versus this is what's happening here? And I think to what extent our sensory perception is shaped by our environment and how we interact with the environment. Bring it back to Helmholtz, the physical interaction and how that shapes what vision is and how we perceive spatiality and forms. I think there's more to learn out of that. And even Huber and Wiesel actually got that. So it's not that they were just like these, in the sense they did these kitten studies where they looked at developmental changes. So it's not exactly entirely new. We just focused on the wrong things because they were so striking.
Well, I think you have to include the textbook Cultural Psychology by Stephen Heine in your reading list because it deals with lots and lots of cultural variation in how people experience emotions, their perception, and all sorts of things. So it's very interesting. So early you touched on a concept in neuroscience, the concept of a map that perhaps applies better to some senses than others. In the case of smell, I mean, is there any map there? And more generally, can we talk about maps in the brain?
So the mapping idea was, of course, absolutely foundational, and it influenced a lot on how neuroscientists talk about representation in terms of the neural representation of signals, as well as how philosophers talk about representation when it comes to mirroring the world or mapping somehow features of the world onto the brain and therefore potentially the mind. In smell, it's different. So this is what's the big discovery really in the last 10, 15 years that people assumed, because every sensory cortex, if you look at vision, has a form of spatial arrangement that looks like a map. There's this famous 1980s study on the primary visual cortex of the macaque, for instance, where they gave it this kind of wheel-like structure, which was then actually represented in the visual cortex, which looked exactly the same. And people are like, whoa, a map in the brain, this is awesome. And you also have it with audition. If you think, for instance, of the auditory cortex having a representation of the different frequencies, it looks beautiful. It's like the keys of a piano. You have the somatosensory and the motor strip where you have your body mapped out. So you've got a spatial representation of what the thing you're sensing is. In smell, you don't have it. So I mentioned before that the cortex, the primary olfactory cortex, is a mosaic. It fans out. It's actually quite beautiful. And I mentioned, like prior, there seems to be something like a map, the olfactory bulb, where you seem to have this fingerprint. Why I say it's not a map is for two reasons. One reason, what it represents is not the chemical stimulus or any kind of chemical map, but the receptor genetics. This is, as I mentioned, the sensory neurons coming to your bulb. And of course, these different glomeruli then represent different chemical features. And it's not that you have in the bulb this type of chemical here and this type of chemical there. Let's say indole here, indole smells like shit, and let's say ketones are over here. And no, you actually have, if you look at it, an interesting overlap between some odors which are similar, which occupy different parts of the bulb, and odorants that are dissimilar, actually occupying similar ranges. And there have been an increasing range of studies suggesting instead of mapping the stimulus, what you're having is more like a evaluation of the statistical frequency with which you're encountering the world. So what features usually come together? So we learn smells by how we interact with the world, the kind of food smells, the kind of environmental smells, and what things are often together. For instance, coffee has a specific group of molecules that we then associate with coffee. And it's much more in terms of, okay, how is our organism interacting with a vastly changing, constantly changing chemical environment? And you have to figure out what's what, how much, in what combination. And this is why I don't think it's a map. It's more of a measure instrument. There is some spatial representation that's mainly just for the brain to organize the stimulus in a certain way. And it might be just more for genetic principles, for developmental principles, but it's not a representation of the stimulus in the world. And this is why it's not a map. It's more of a developmentally induced spatial representation, but we shouldn't take this. The map is not the territory, but in a much more complicated sense. It's really just how the brain is wired up rather than how the world is constituted. And what we're forgetting if we're focusing too much on maps is temporal coding. And I think this is one of the most interesting ways to understand the brain. It's closer to music in a certain way, that you're looking for certain rhythms, you're looking for certain temporal frequencies, you're looking for certain oscillations and how they couple with each other. There's much more interesting stuff to come, and there has been some interesting work already on insect olfaction, showing precisely this to be it's like a Morse code for odors rather than a map for odors.
So, an easy question now. Do we experience the real world?
Okay, you got. uh, okay, so I like that you hit me by the end with the easy question. It's sort of like, the hard problem or the hard question. Well, we do, but we don't do it in the way philosophers like to describe, because what we are perceiving is I mean, one of the cool things with smells, you've got this direct, I like the way that for a moment you had me there, but you have a direct material contact. Like vision, audition, you perceive objects from a distance. You've got surface reflections. You don't perceive like the flowers directly in your eye, that would hurt. But with smell, the molecules touch and tangle with your nose. So when you go to a public toilet and it smells of shit, yes, there are shitty molecules actually hitting your receptors. So this is the most direct material context you can have, and notably with two synapses to the brain, like whoa. So there is a reality behind that, and just because there's a varying expression of it, a varying sensation of it, doesn't mean it's less real. Because what you're doing is you are interpreting the signals in relation to your body. Smells mean something to your body. Is it in a certain concentration? Most smells, most odorants become toxic. So of course, like in lower concentration, they mean something different for your physiology. And this signal is not arbitrary. I mean, we are not suddenly perceiving roses as I don't know, as coffee. But there is a material reality behind it, but there's also a relational aspect to what extent what it really means. It's kind of both exteroceptive as well as interoceptive. It's a combined sense, and this is why it's a measure, not a map again, and why it might tell us more about other senses as well, such as interoception, such as proprioception. I think there are much more interesting things to get out rather than just to look at objects independently of us. I mean, even vision doesn't work that way, although we sometimes like to describe it like that.
So, in the book, you mentioned the fact that to really understand how the sense of smell works, we have to have an interdisciplinary approach to it, and include disciplines like chemistry, biology, neuroscience, psychology, and even philosophy. I mean, how do you think about how interdisciplinarity works in academia? Because many times it's really hard to get it right, or even it's hard for people from different departments, for example, to communicate with one another, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, this is where I was lucky with smell, because there is no. It's starting to form more and more, but at least it's still one of those few areas which is interdisciplinary by nature, by its own history and by its contemporary development, because you really, as you say, you've got all these different disciplines which are somewhat interacting, because there are not so few of us, so we're happy to talk to other people interested in smell. That being said, to publish it is increasingly hard when it comes to interdisciplinary research. It's a big buzzword, and every grant application wants it to be interdisciplinary. I'm a bit more skeptical of that, because I think it is just a buzzword, and we don't look enough at the infrastructure that would facilitate that kind of the real kind of interdisciplinarity needed. Because if you try to publish articles, they're in specialist journals, and I had extreme difficulties getting anything published for a long time. The book helped a lot, but philosophers found me too scientific. Scientists were much more welcoming, actually, about the philosophical parts of it, but this is where there's a growth of philosophical interest in interdisciplinary science literate work. However, this is often conflated with, I just need to read a couple of reviews. That is not empirically based. Reading a couple of scientific articles and reviews doesn't give you the knowledge to understand the science, both when it comes to how studies come about, why certain questions are asked, what are the limits of a study, what is a study really showing. Quite often people in philosophy read scientific articles to just, okay, this kind of fits with my argument here. That is not interdisciplinary work. You have to be able to understand the conceptual foundation of a scientific study, and then to see to what extent has that certain philosophical implications. Does that link, or might it actually link to a different way of philosophical thinking about a problem? On the other hand, I do think that there is an interest in interdisciplinary work, but we need to wake up to the buzzword is not what we're trying to do, and we need to change the infrastructure, publication, funding, etc. I mean, sometimes interdisciplinarity, last rant I'm having, is that you see people say, I combine philosophy of language with phenomenology. That's not interdisciplinary. You use philosophy of X with philosophy of Y. That's not interdisciplinary. I mean, really, it's a word that has been diluted so much into meaningless studies that it's, yeah.
Yeah.
We got to be a bit more honest with what it means. But there has been great work already, and it's not a new thing. It's been a debate for decades. And this is where we shall also, we would do better if we look at our predecessors and the people who made this kind of research already. The Churchians I mentioned a couple of times, John Bickel, of course, also Daniel Dennett, just when it comes to philosophy of neuroscience, philosophy of mind, but also philosophy of physics has a variety of people. So there have been really good people out there who've been doing that. And instead of just exercising the same things and reinventing the wheel, we might just learn from the people who did it well, and then, like Newton, stand on the shoulders of giants and do more, do better. Yeah.
Yeah. So, how do you look at the relationship, since we're talking about interdisciplinarity, the relationship between science and philosophy nowadays? Because I guess that from an historical perspective, until very recently, it was very easy for philosophers to be sort of armchair philosophers, and I mean to speculate about, in this case, for example, how the mind works, and not really have any empirical inputs into their questions and their theories, let's say. But nowadays, since science, neuroscience more specifically, is much more developed than it was until, I don't know, last century or even 200 years ago. So what do you think is the role that philosophy can play in science?
I think we are actually at the crossroads of a fantastic new challenge. So I sometimes like to bash philosophers for being armchair philosophers, but for the simple reason, not because I think philosophy is useless, but precisely to the contrary, that philosophy right now is more needed than ever, but good philosophy, and not this kind of armchair philosophy. That is not to say that theoretical work is irrelevant, but to actually really engage with the questions that are on the table, rather than just to exercise things that have been a problem 100, 200 years ago without looking at how does that really translate? And what philosophy can do is not just simply, oh, we kind of look at some kind of conceptual distinctions, but much more, what are the open questions right now? What are the kind of challenges right now? What's the missing knowledge? And can philosophers collaborate with scientists to develop new questions? What shall be the next question? So when it comes to smell, for instance, this is why I think it was such a great opportunity for me. Many of the open questions right now are deeply philosophical. What are odors? What kind of information is actually processed and represented in the brain? How does, for instance, our sensory experience then really relate to chemical information? What is being categorized? What is being grouped? What kind of cognitive principles underlie that? These are questions that the scientists ask, where philosophers are well equipped actually to look at these questions. Because sometimes you hear, what are the perceptual dimensions of smell? And then you see different articles going for, oh, there's one dimension, the hedonic dimension, or there's 32, or there's 400, or 1 trillion. Well, clearly we mean different things here when we talk about like perceptual dimension or certain features. So philosophers are very, if they understand what the scientists are studying, they can show to what extent these different notions relate, do not relate. What is the actual question here? Is it even different approaches or different questions? And what shall we ask next? So you mentioned memory, for instance. Well, how does, for instance, when we think of smell and memory, instead of looking at stimulus representation models, like, okay, this feature is that category, more in terms of what are the potential mechanisms, cognitive, social, and biological, that influence how we form and group things as mental images. And I think there are interesting ways to go, not just with smell, but think of Alzheimer, to what extent there's a change in Alzheimer research now. When it comes to interoception, if I had a graduate student knocking on my door right now, and it's like, well, what's the next thing? I would say go for interoception. How does breathing, heartbeats, circadian rhythms, all that stuff influence cognition? This is astounding. It's a growing field of science. There are open conceptual questions. I think philosophers have a great deal to contribute if they just do the work.
Yeah, so I think this will be my final question, and it's related to this last one. So, would you say that in science there are good and bad, right and wrong questions to ask, and the way scientists approach things in their particular fields can be improved with a philosophical understanding or a philosophical approach to things?
I think so, not because the scientists are incapable. I think this is a wrong way to go, but there are certain things that there's so much time in the day, and there is so much pressure from funding agencies where to get the money from. And I'll give you an example where I think we are currently asking the wrong question and where a philosophical perspective might show why that is the wrong question. It's the whole structure odor modeling, where people are now throwing algorithms at chemical data to find out how the chemicals link to our perceptual categories. And this is the kind of stimulus to perception trope that I want of, where it's like there is a biological system in between, and there's psychology in between. And that shows why this is, you might do some nice data fitting here and there and some interesting correlations here and there, but you will not explain the system, you will not explain what olfaction is, and you're not looking at the causal mechanisms that link the two together. So you're basically just mapping things onto each other, but correlation is not causation. So if you look for a couple of correlations, fine, but that's not what they claim. They claim, like, we can look at the chemical data to figure out, we can decode olfaction. Nonsense. And this is where philosophers can actually say, well, this is nonsense for these and these reasons. This is why this question is ill-framed. This is why this question was based, for instance, on an outdated model of perception that was actually pre-scientific. It doesn't even apply to vision. I mean, seriously, it doesn't even apply to vision. You wouldn't, for instance, if you just look at pink, there is no wavelength for pink. Similar, there is no chemical for instance, olfactory white, Lorex, discovered by Noah and Sobel. So I mentioned also, what about androstenone, which people perceive differently? Where's the algorithm of that? Furthermore, there were recent receptor studies showing that recent machine learning studies in olfaction that tried to do the mapping chemicals to perception didn't even recognize one of the most fundamental features, like molecular features relevant to odor coding when it comes to receptor studies, namely the polar surface area. So we're clearly missing something here, and it's good for philosophers to jump in and show to what extent just looking at molecules and a couple of words is not perception. It's a simplified image, but words are not perception or perceptual quality, but we need to kind of carve out what the different mechanisms is we're trying to correlate here, and to what extent they really link up, or where there's still some open questions.
Yeah. Okay, so where can people find you on the internet?
Sorry. Well, they can find me on my website, smellosophy.com. This is how the book title started, coming full circle, and also on Twitter, Smellosopher.
Okay,
and
great.
I think also at my university. I think I'm also employed at a real job. So yes.
Okay, so guys, the book is again Smellosophy, What the Nose Tells the Mind. run and buy it. It's a very interesting book, but don't go outside, of course. Order it on Amazon. Just run to your computer and do that. And Dr. Barwich, it was really a pleasure to have you on the show again. Thank you for taking the time.
Well, thank you for the discussion. I had a lot of fun. It was nice to see you again.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel back in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with top academics and scholars from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. If you prefer PayPal, I also have links to that in the description box of the video. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please leave a like, share it, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litzke and Blanchett Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Anian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Henrik Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windeger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Mikkel Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Yugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Deza Araújo, Eden Solan, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, and Yannick Punter. My producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Codriano, Luís Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Vanegdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Nirban Balachandran, and my executive producers, Michal Ruzieski, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.